Welcome, Guillaume.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third program in the Hispanic Society's 2020-2021 concert series, Apolo y Dafne, a zarzuela by Sebastián Durón y Juan de Navas. My name is Guillaume Kins. I'm the director of the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's program. Tonight, Sonnambula's Jude, Ziliak, and James Kennerley present an enchanting pre-recorded concert of baroque music with the 18th century, featuring rarely heard gems by Jose Herrando, Juan Oliver y Astorga, Domenico Scarlatti, and Marianna Martinez. There will be a Q&A with the artist after the concert, so don't be shy and feel free to leave any questions or comments in the chat bar during the event. Before we begin, I would like to thank the members of the Friends Group of the Hispanic Society for their continued support and remind that this program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and New York State Council, on the Arts. We are all very grateful. Now, please enjoy tonight's program. It's always a pleasure to entertain you and an honor to have you as our guest. I now leave the screen to Elizabeth Winefield. Thanks, Elizabeth, once again for being with us tonight. You can chill out and relax. You're in very good hands. Enjoy the night.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, and good evening to everyone tuning in from home. My name is Elizabeth Winefield. I'm the artistic director of Sonnambula, and it's my pleasure to co-introduce our third concert program on our Hispanic Society concert series this evening, which features, as Guillaume mentioned, two musicians from Sonnambula, Jude Ziliak on baroque violin and James Kennerley on the harpsichord. This is our first newly produced concert since the start of the pandemic, and it gives us, I think, a real taste of what I hope is to come, which is the return of live music. Our program tonight will run about 43 minutes altogether and will comprise 4 pieces of music. The first piece we'll hear tonight is the Sonata in E minor by Domenico Scarlatti, number 81. Domenico Scarlatti was born in Naples in 1685, which was the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel. Like Handel, Scarlatti spent most of his career away from his native land. Handel, of course, in England, but Scarlatti in Spain. In fact, very much like Handel in England, Scarlatti would really become a leading musical figure in his adopted country of Spain. Scarlatti lived in Spain from 1729 until his death in 1757, and he was fascinated by the country's vast musical traditions, notably Andalusian folk music. So listen in this sonata for how Scarlatti incorporates both melodic and harmonic traits of Andalusian folk style into the work, something also about which to ask our musicians at the end of the program. The second piece in our program is by Jose Herrando, his sonata with the very descriptive subtitle, The Garden of Aranjuez in Springtime, with diverse songs of bird and other animals. Herrando was the preeminent Spanish violinist of his generation. He was the first violinist at the Royal Chapel in Madrid, where his colleagues included Scarlatti and also the famous castrato Farinelli. He wrote the first Spanish language treatise on violin playing, and he published that treatise in 1756. And we really see the results of that work in this piece, which exploits the instrument for the array of sounds that it can produce. This is a sonata that depicts the springtime in the garden. It's the vast garden of the royal palace in Madrid. Much like, for example, Vivaldi's Four Seasons or Bieber's Sonata Representativa, which contain vivid, evocative depictions, we're going to hear in this piece evocations of features like streams, storms, and even bird songs. So as Jude plays, listen for how the violin depicts the canary, the cuckoo, the nightingale, the quail, and, no stranger to us in New York, the pigeon. The third piece on our program this evening is a work that is very dear to my heart, the Harpsichord Sonata in G major by the Spanish-Viennese composer Marianna Martinez. This is a three-movement work. You'll hear an allegro brillante, an andante, and an allegro assai, beautifully performed this evening by James Kennerley. And finally, we'll complete the concert with the piece that perhaps gives our program its title, the very virtuosic Sonata No. 5 by Juan Oliver y Astorga. This is a piece that dates from 1767 during Astorga's time in England. Astorga was very itinerant in his early years. He worked in Italy, he worked in Germany, and he also worked for several years in London, where he performed with none other than Abel and Johann Christian Bach. Astorga was reputedly the finest Spanish violinist of his generation, and this piece is likely meant to showcase his own abilities on the violin. Now, there are two ways in which you can view tonight's program. One is by simply doing nothing. Simply stay right here and we'll stream it on this YouTube link that you're watching right now. The other is for the audiophiles among you. If you'd like a slightly better quality stream, then click the link that is being provided in the chat bar below right now. This will open a new window where you can view the concert yourself in your own time. However, if you do that, don't forget to mute this video. Otherwise, you'll hear the concert twice at the same time. And you probably don't want to do that. Now, after the concert is finished, come back here or stay right here, because immediately following that program, Jude Ziliak and James Kennerley will be right here in real time to continue the discussion about the program and to field your questions, which you can submit down below in the chat bar here on YouTube. So with that, it is my pleasure to share with you Virtuosos Españoles, Spanish masterworks of the 18th century with Jude Ziliak and James Kennerley. Enjoy.
All right. Bravo to you, James. Are we here? Is everybody back?
Yes, we are back. Thank you, Jude.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to everybody at the Hispanic Society for making this possible. And thank you to my lovely wife, Elizabeth, who introduced this event. And we also wanted to give special thanks to Hudson View Productions, Tatiana Dobek and Gonzalo Ruiz, for their fantastic work on the audio and video. And also, finally, sorry for all the thank yous to the to SEDEM, the Spanish Society of Musicology, for the research that went into the editions of the Herrando and Astorga, which are not easy to locate, and we're grateful to them for making them available to the world. Hi, James.
Hi.
Bravo for your Martinez. Is that the Martinez that I see behind you?
It is, yeah. I don't know if any of you can see the background, but this is actually the first page of the first movement of the Martinez Sonata, probably in the composer's hands. So that's the music that I played from and that you just heard.
Very cool. Her handwriting is so clear.
It's nice, isn't it? It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So, James, we have an interesting question from the chat, which I want to, and I want to encourage anybody watching to submit questions if you have them. So there was this question: are there particular oddities or challenges about learning this music, preparing this music, as opposed to other works from the same period? And I'm curious if you had thoughts about this, about any of the works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes. The answer is a very definite yes. And from my point of view, as the harpsichord player, or more specifically in this point, we call it the continuo player. And that's really because this music was written in two parts. There's a violin part, generally with single notes, or sometimes with two or three, as you heard Jude play brilliantly. And then there's a bass line with just generally a single line of notes. And that's the line that I have to play from as the harpsichord player, or the basso continuo player. And so what that involves is an awful lot of improvisation, working things out on the spot, deciding which chords should go where. The composers generally give an idea, either through implication of the harmony, you can see the two parts and see how they work together, but also they leave numbers underneath. We call that figured bass, and that tells the keyboard player what chords to add above those bass notes. But in a lot of the music, in fact, I think in almost all of the music, certainly the Herrando and the Astorga, there were no figures. So the composer really left it to the basso continuo player, the harpsichordist, to work those things out for themselves. And that was fairly common. I mean, people like Bach did that a lot of the time, unless they were very specific about exactly what chords they wanted. But I think because this music, especially the Sonata da Representativa, the Primavera, expressive, programmatic sonata that calls for all these colors, well, the music doesn't tell the harpsichord player in particular what to do. And so I presumed to add an awful lot to that. In fact, almost everything you heard was me reacting to what Jude did in terms of his notes, and then the harpsichord sort of responding in a call and response type thing. So I think in that perspective, from the basso continuo harpsichord point of view, these are wonderfully unusual pieces, and that gives us these wonderful examples to improvise and to make something new.
That's so interesting. It's different from the challenges that the violinist receives, because the violin line is pretty thoroughly written out, although there's space for improvisation here and there. But I was also thinking about the integration of folk elements in this music, which is, you know, in some other repertoire, for example, in Lully, when you go from a complex sort of recitativo or Rameau, when you go from a recitativo texture to dances and the folk influence comes out, I think of it as the moment where the music gets simpler and easier to understand. But actually, in the case of this music, maybe just because of my own comparative unfamiliarity with Andalusian folk music, I actually found the folk passages a little bit more they required a little more investigation on my part, a little more. There are these very short phrases. I was looking at Ralph Kirkpatrick's wonderful biography of Scarlatti the other day, and he suggested that Scarlatti's relative lack of success as an opera composer compared to his keyboard work, his celebrity as a keyboard composer, had to do with the fact that he adopted this practice of writing extremely short gestures and extremely short phrases that translate absolutely brilliantly in instrumental music, but result in singers kind of putting out these very brief phrases and then changing the subject, which he thought was an odd fit for opera. And I thought, as I thought about it, I thought that maybe that was characteristic of a number of places in these pieces. For example, in the middle movement of the Astorga, when we just play ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, and that's it, you know.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, really.
Totally. And I think 50 years ago, people would have said that this music just wasn't as developed as, say, its Italian or its Viennese counterpart. And nowadays, because we have exposure to this repertoire, we know that's just not the case. In fact, I think, as you say, the influence of folk music, Spanish folk music, is so strong. And Scarlatti wrote over 550 of these keyboard sonatas. The one we played, of course, was originally probably written as a solo piece, but with the option of having a violin or an instrument playing the upper part. But I think even there, that's a relatively, I'm going to use the derogatory term Italianate, which means sort of very safe music in the sense that it had very clear, fast, slow, fast in terms of the movements and the gestures, as Jude was saying, were still very dramatic and bold. I mean, that music grabs you, whether it's a slow lyric phrase or dum, da, 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 da. It really does attract the attention of the listener. And that's what I think runs through the music of this program. And I do think that comes from the folk influence. We think of the sort of guitar Spanish music of the 17th century and the flamenco tradition, and that becomes a little bit of a stereotype, I think, but it cannot be overstated how powerfully this affected the music of the composers that we have just performed for you. That idea of the strum of the guitar, that comes across very obviously in the harpsichord music because it's related to the guitar tradition. It really is just a harpsichord, a guitar sort of placed on its side, and instead of plucking the strings with my literal fingers, with a plectrum, the fingers are individually plucked. Sorry, the strings are individually plucked by a bird quill. Originally, nowadays we use sort of a plastic prototype that plucks the strings, so you still get that intense energy that you don't get from, say, the piano, where you're really hitting the keys with the mallet, but with this you're plucking. So I really think absolutely that the idea of folk music, Spanish folk music, it permeates the gestures and the affect of all the pieces that we performed for today. Yeah.
I love that kind of tactile quality to the harpsichord sound. Playing with a harpsichord is so much more of a rhythmically visceral experience than playing with a piano or certainly with another string instrument. There's just an amazing way that you're compelled to bounce off of the bass notes. It's a wonderful thing. The other question.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, I was thinking, one question that came through asked about the, let me see if I can find it here. It says it's more difficult to play programmatic depictions, such as those in the Herrando, than it is to play sheer music. And that's a very good question, because this music is not your sort of standard sonata type music. This is music that's representing nature. And of course, it's representing it in very artificial forms because the harpsichord, the violin, they're all very man-made instruments. They use strings and bows and plectra and fingers and keys. And so I wonder, Jude, maybe you want to talk about how those challenges were you faced those in the Herrando.
Certainly. Well, the Herrando requires a lot of imagination, I think. I mean, when you look on the page at the depictions of the different birds and other things, sometimes it's quite obvious how it's meant to translate. For example, in the first movement, there are a few places where the harpsichord just stops altogether, and you go up to the top of the fingerboard and play really, really high notes for a little bit. And it's kind of almost like a little cadenza, or if you were walking in the garden, maybe you've heard a bird song and it's caught your attention and you've paused and listened to it, and it doesn't require a big leap of imagination. But in other cases, trying to guess how he intended this notation, which doesn't look too different from the other music on the page around it, to imitate the sound of a particular bird, really did require some imagination. Luckily, I live near a park with lots of birds in it, so some walking was research. But it was, but you know, I also think, so in that sense, it does require work and imagination of a different kind. But I also think that in some ways it is almost like a Rosetta Stone to music that is not explicitly programmatic from the same period, because that kind of gestural and kind of almost literal madrigalistic, if you will, depiction of specific ideas is characteristic of melodic writing in this period, in many, many, many works that are not explicitly programmatic in any way. So I think it's kind of, it's like an invitation to look differently at music that doesn't say anything about cuckoos and canaries.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you, James?
It certainly does, yeah. And I hope to the listeners that it does too. And I hope it was obvious to you that, not you, Jude, but hopefully it was obvious to you, because you are representing them. But I hope that when the listeners heard those sounds, that they could hear the cuckoos and the nightingales and the pigeons and the quails, and there was the agua, the running water. And that was fun as the keyboard player, of course. I think in the score there is just a single bass line note, or maybe there's nothing. And so that was, if you had super good memory and remember a few minutes back to when we played that piece, I did some kind of scale that sort of ran down, or something like that. And I think I tried to do something different every time. Because how do you represent water flowing on a harpsichord? I mean, the thing goes pluck. And so we had to think very carefully. But of course, the idea, you know, something like that could easily apply to a non-programmatic piece when you're trying to create a very soft, sort of luscious sense of sound. And I loved how those programmatic things, as you said, it really makes us think about the sound of our instruments. And how do we make sound? How do we communicate? How do we sort of form emotion in the listener through the sound of our instruments? And I think coming up with animal noises is a very powerful way of doing that, and it translates to all the other melodies that we play in textures.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, there's an old, it was believed a long time ago that all 18th century music was comprised of movements with one single affect within them, right? Like every movement had one character which did not waver, and the purpose of the movement was to express it. And over time, of course, we've come to understand that those affects had lots of internal modulations, just as if you were giving a speech that was intended to persuade on a particular topic, you would address many aspects of it and not speak in the same manner the whole way through. And the idea of depicting these different things in the sound and the touch and the timbre and the continual realization and the ornaments, it to me is a stimulus for considering the ways in which we might depart from the kind of ordinary or default sounds that we make, and default articulations and things like that in all the repertoire. And I have to say, playing the Scarlatti, which is more sort of Italianate and classical in a way than the other pieces that we played, was more fun, I think, and more stimulating in this context. Yeah, I'm curious, James, if there about the Martinez. If there are things about this piece that are markedly different than her Viennese contemporaries, because as some of our listeners may know, she lived her entire life in Vienna, although she was Spanish by birth. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, it's very difficult to, without a diary, and sometimes even with a diary, to determine what the composer was thinking. But I can certainly say from the pieces, as I say, one of them is behind you there, if you can read that. I don't know if it's an inverse mirror image, but she left about 3 or 4 harpsichord keyboard sonatas, really in Vienna in the 18th century. They would have used the term clavier, really meaning keyboard, and that could mean an organ, it could mean a harpsichord, it could mean a clavichord, it could mean the forte piano. And really all of these pieces could be played on any one of those instruments. But this piece is very harpsichord-like. And even though, as Jude was saying, she lived in this building with the Esterhazy family, which is a sort of very grand family of Vienna that patronized many very famous artists, including Haydn, who lived upstairs, I think, on the top floor of this building in the Michaelerplatz. And the Martinez family lived in the middle, about the 3rd floor. They were fairly wealthy, middle class, and the wealthiest people lived on the ground floor with the biggest rooms, presumably the less noise or something. And so Martinez studied with Mozart, she studied with Haydn, and her pieces really do have this sense, we spoke about it earlier, of very immediate, very powerful gestures. And as you were saying about the affect, I think that the gesture is a little bit more short term. And so this starts as yum, well, that's one. That's a scale that goes up and it uses 16th notes, and you could sort of see them whirring behind me. They're all over the place. But you can see then there are these other characters which are arpeggiated. That means literally like a harp. And so you've immediately got this contrast of one scalic gesture and then arpeggiated triplets, so ta-ta-ta-ta rather than ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And then immediately after about 10 seconds, you have a totally new idea in a totally new key in E minor. It starts in G major, which is arresting. I mean, even if you don't know about music and keys and things, that would make a listener, hopefully nowadays, certainly in the 18th century, go, wow, you know, what just happened? It would really turn heads. Turn ears, and then there's a lot of chromaticism and little scalic passages that have very short notes, acciaccature, and that comes directly from the Spanish guitar tradition. The idea of plucking out yum, and this is the idea of Martinez trying to represent that on the harpsichord, and so we have a direct link to that folk, that guitar, Spanish music tradition that come through in these pieces. So I think just in that first page of that first movement alone, we have a direct signs of those Spanish influences. I wonder, I'd love to know whether Martinez herself would have thought, oh yes, I'm channeling my Spanish roots here. And it's difficult because Vienna was so cosmopolitan and Italian music was a strong dominant force. But it seems very clear to me, you know, playing Mozart, playing Haydn, playing Martinez. In fact, I played all of these sonatas, and they are very, very clearly defined in terms of those stylistic traits. And I think that's where their charm and their power comes from.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. Now, for you, in terms of the violin, how do these pieces translate? Do they seem overtly Spanish to you? Are there things you have to do that are sort of out of the ordinary, as it were, to make them work?
In terms of the instrument, not terribly much so. In terms of the, I think for me, the differences are mostly at the level of the structure and the phrasing and the harmony, the way that the melodies work. I think the way that the composers used the instrument is, well, I don't know. It's very interesting in the case of Herrando, who was very adventurous in terms of the way he exploited the upper reaches. He was quite fearless about it.
And we should say to our listeners that when Jude talks about those high notes very graciously, just saying, oh, very high, they're about as high as you can get. And higher on violin equals more difficult. I think it's fair to say. Higher on the harpsichord is the same as low on the harpsichord. It's the same as middle. But high on the violin, those gaps become smaller and smaller. And it's highly virtuosic playing that you just showed us.
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't have nearly as many notes to deal with it at a time as you do.
Fair enough.
But there are, but yeah, I mean, the Herrando literally takes your fingers off of the fingerboard. My violin is set up pretty much the way a violin would have been set up in the 1730s, I think, when he wrote this. I have sort of a mid-18th century setup on my instrument. and the fingerboard is a lot shorter than the modern fingerboard of a violin. And for one particular note in the Herrando, my finger was decidedly off, like a good centimeter off of the fingerboard. So he's really pushing the envelope there. But beyond that adventurousness from a technical perspective, I mean, Astorga too, I mean, really, these guys were clearly extremely accomplished virtuosos, assuming that they played what they wrote. Is remarkable in that regard.
Related to this, I have a question here from someone who says they know nothing about music, which is great because that's why we're here. But they asked, were these pieces specifically composed for one violin, one harpsichord? Would it be desirable, possible to add instruments, experiment with sound, adding more strings, percussion, etc.? That's a great question because I think for me now, as Jude said, he's playing on an instrument from this period, and that's important because it you know, in some way it gives us the same context as the composers, the performers of that day in terms of the sound you could make, the sounds you were able to make. And likewise, the harpsichord I'm playing is not from the 18th century, but it's built in a very closely replicated style, down to the nearest millimeter, copied from an instrument, actually from France, but one that a style that Martinez certainly would have known and performed on. And it was actually built in the United States in the 1980s by a very fine builder on the West Coast. And so we are using the tools, essentially, the instruments, that were, at least structurally, and we hope in terms of their sound sonically, are what the composers would have known. And that's not giving us a gateway into just channeling the pure intentions of the composer. Of course it isn't, but it does get us closer, I would say, than using a modern violin or a modern piano. And so I would say that you certainly could add instruments to any of these pieces. You could arrange them, transcribe them for symphony orchestra, and that happened with the works of Bach, for example, that were written for the organ or the harpsichord by Stokowski in the 20th century. And you certainly could add percussion, you could add voices, you could do all kinds of things. I think that probably takes the pieces out of their original context, and I expect the composers would have said, hang on a minute, that's not my piece, that's become somebody else's. But you certainly could. But I think our intention, at least, is to represent as closely as possible the composer's intentions, fully acknowledging that we're 21st century people and we're going to impose a certain amount of our own free will, and that's fine too. And that's what makes live music and performance exciting. I don't know, Jude, does that make sense to you?
It certainly does. I think that's all exactly right. If you go back maybe about a century and a half before this, the majority of instrumental music written before that point is not for any particular instrument. But by this time, most instrumental music, I think, probably at least was nominally intended for a particular instrument. And certainly the Herrando and the Astorga and the Martinez are very clearly idiomatic for the instruments that they are that we played them on. The Scarlatti is interesting in that I think there's room for a legitimate question about whether whether this particular sonata was intended for keyboard alone or for violin and continuo or some other melody instrument, flute or oboe perhaps, and continuo. My understanding is that they've been played as continuo sonatas more and more often in the last 15 years or so, and I don't actually know why, but I know that has become a kind of prevailing trend, and I'm certainly maybe we're poaching from you guys from the keyboard repertoire, but I'm delighted to do so since it's so beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the important thing to mention, we talk about the composers, the instruments, the performers, but there's also the audience, the listeners. Who is this music for? And there's no real way to recreate that. Most of this music was written for private performance, clearly not over YouTube or Zoom. The idea of a screen and speakers would have been utterly foreign in the 18th century, as it would have been in the 19th century, even though some people may have dreamt of it in their wildest fantasies. And so we're always, as historical performers, keeping the music current. very much in the present day, in the present minutes, the present second, but that wonderful, tangible connection to the past. And I think that sort of stands to the power of this music. And I really must say to the foresight of the Hispanic Society and Elizabeth's brilliant curating of this program, that it sounds modern. It sounds like this music was just written. It has a freshness and a vivacious nature that I really think shows that this is not, we're not recreating a museum piece, which is interesting because, of course, in a museum, there are many paintings, I expect, in the Hispanic Society that weren't painted or created to be put in a gallery to be, gawped at by tourists. They were perhaps from private homes or from religious buildings, etc. So we're always thinking about that interplay between composer and audience and performer. But it's a fascinating dialogue as always.
Absolutely. Well, this was fun, James.
It was awesome.
Fun to do this program with you, and I hope we'll get to do it again soon.
Definitely, yeah.
But meanwhile, I guess we should say thank you to Guillaume and Christina and Mencia and everybody else at the HSA. And I hope that everybody listening will join us next month for the streaming world modern premiere, we think, of excerpts from Durón and Navas's Apolo y Dafne. And thank you so much to everybody who tuned in. And we wish you all a great night. Good night, James.
Good night, Jude. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you both so much.